Okay. So like everything else, I want us to start with a music, just to open our minds, open our souls, even though all the greetings, we're already like, we're ready to go, but music is always a beautiful way to start. So the format will be, we'll do the music. I'll do a very quick introduction of the faith, and all of us know that how can you put the vastness of Baha'u'llah's revelation into a few seconds, few minutes. So it's going to be very brief. I want to make sure that we have time for, as Judy is going to go through the presentation, if you have any questions, if you can put it into chat. There's quite a few of us, so it's going to be very difficult if everybody raises their hand. So as you think of a question, please put it through the chat. And if you want to be personally invited to these gatherings, you can put your email in the chat as well. And Firuz and her team will make sure that you get a personal invitation. And once I go through the presentation, little bit of the introduction, then I will be honored to introduce Judy to all of us.
As waves of the sea, as flowers of the garden, united and green, through the bounties of thy love. Make us as waves of the sea, as flowers of the garden, united and green, through the bounties of thy love. Make all mankind as stars, shining from the same light of glory, as perfect fruit, growing upon the tree of life. Make us as waves of the sea, as flowers of the garden, united and green, the bounties of thy love. Make us as waves of the sea, as flowers of the garden, united and green, the bounties of thy love. Make all mankind as stars, shining from the same light of glory, as perfect fruit, growing upon the tree of life. Waves of the sea, us as waves of the sea, as flowers of the garden, united agree through the bounties of thy love. Make all may come as stars, shining from the same light of glory, as perfect fruit, growing upon the tree of life, growing upon the tree of life, growing upon the tree of life, because the waves of the sea, because the waves of the sea, because the waves of the sea, because the waves of the sea.
Throughout history, God has sent to humanity a series of divine educators, known as manifestations of God, whose teachings have provided the basis for the advancement of civilization. These manifestations have included Abraham, Krishna, Zoroaster, Moses, Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad. Baha'u'llah, the latest of these messengers, explain that the religions of the world come from the same source and are in essence successive chapters of one religion from God. Baha'is believe the crucial need facing humanity is to find a unifying vision of the future of society and of the nature and purpose of life. Such a vision unfolds in the writings of Baha'u'llah. In thousands upon thousands of locations around the world, the teachings of the Baha'i faith inspire individuals and communities as they work to improve their own lives and contribute to the advancement of civilization. Baha'i beliefs address such essential themes as the oneness of God and religion, the oneness of humanity, from freedom from prejudice, the inherent nobility of the human being, the progressive revelation of religious truth, the development of spiritual qualities, the integration of worship and service, the fundamental equality of the sexes, the harmony between religion and science, the importance of education, the dynamics of the relationships that are to bind together individuals, communities, and institutions as humanity advances towards its collective maturity. It is with such thoughts in mind that Baha'is enter into collaboration with an increasing number of movements, organizations, groups, and individuals, establishing partnerships that strive to transform society and further the cause of unity. This gives me huge pleasure to introduce Judy, author Judy Hannen Moe, the great-granddaughter of Joseph and Pauline Hannen, has combed through several archival collections in order to piece together the story of these inspiring souls. And we will hear of one such story tonight, as well as those of others in their orbit. Judy is a retired ESL teacher whose Baha'i ancestry dates back to 1902 in Washington, D.C. She lives with her husband, Bruce, in Rockford, Illinois, where she has served on the local spiritual assembly for many years, serving the community. She has 2 grown children and 1 grandchild. Aflame with Devotion is her first book. Judy will inspire all of us tonight with the story of Louis Gregory. His story is an illustration of God's guidance to a receptive soul. Louis Gregory became an illumined soul that inspired thousands around the world. We will get a glimpse into his noble character and distinguished service to humanity, this very, very loved man. Pauline and Joseph Hannen, that is, became the spiritual parents of Louis Gregory. So Judy is the great-granddaughter of Joseph and Pauline Hannen, as I said earlier. But there is a special connection between our two families. My two sisters and I, when we fled our home country, Iran, the three of us, we were 11, 13, and 15. And we found the most amazing mother in Barbara Hannen. Barbara Hannen is the great-granddaughter, the granddaughter, not the great. And so Barbara Hannen is Judy's aunt, and obviously Judy is Barbara's niece. Barbara became our spiritual mother when we needed her. So there is this beautiful connection between our families. So it actually gives me true joy and honor to introduce to you guys Judy, and I'm going to give the floor to her. So Judy, it's all of our honor to be listening to you tonight. And thank you again, Ferouz, for having these wonderful spaces where we can all learn from one another. So Judy, please.
Probably while you were talking, I should have been finding my thing. But anyway, but before I even start, I just want to say thank you to Amelia for inviting me, and also to Ferouz. I hope I'm saying it right. But anyway, for allowing me to be doing this. I'm really honored. And it was wonderful. Just when my book first came out, Amelia invited me to come to Niagara Falls and do a talk about it. And it was so wonderful to spend time with her, because I lived up here and she lived down in Florida. So we didn't see each other that much as, when she was growing up, but we still felt like she was part of our family, and it's so wonderful to get to know her more. So anyway, we're going to, I haven't, since the pandemic, I haven't been out giving these kinds of talks. So just bear with us while we get everything set up here. And I think I have to touch that or that. There we go. And find my thing. I was so impressed with all of you. I wasn't getting this all ready. But it shouldn't take too long. So, is everybody ready? We'll get started with this. I'm going to be talking about Hand of the Cause of God, Louis Gregory, mostly, and also the connections between his family and my ancestors, between he and my ancestors especially. And I'm going to start out just by showing you a few places that have been named for Louis Gregory, just to see, what a wonderful station he has really in the Baha'i faith, and especially in the American Baha'is. There are just so many honors that have been given to him. This is a museum in Charleston, South Carolina, where he was raised, in this house, actually. And so the house eventually became the property of the Baha'is, and there's a museum there. The man on the left is Al Nesmith. He's the kind of the curator or caretaker of the place. He invited me to come to South Carolina a couple of years ago too, to talk about all of this. So I was just overjoyed to meet him and to see this museum. It's wonderful. I hope if you ever go to South Carolina, get in touch with him and make an appointment. Go see that. And then also I was able to go to the Gregory Baha'i Institute, which I'd heard about all my life, but I grew up near the House of Worship in Wilmette, and so I just didn't travel much until much later in my life. And I finally got to go there and spend some time. That was built in the 60s when there was a lot of teaching going on in that state, and a lot of Baha'is from around the country would go down there and did what they called like direct or door-to-door teaching, and they had thousands of people becoming Baha'is, and they needed a place, so they built this institute to house them, or to, you know, so that they could come and have meetings and things like that. And then also they established a radio station that's still going now. It's 24/7. It has Baha'i music and talks. I actually got to talk on it, and just all kinds of things that are helpful to the community there. Lots of advice and all kinds of things. Anyway, so those things are actually made in honor of WLGI, is Louis Gregory Institute. So that's pretty cool. Right, just to give you an idea, it looks like, you know, a lot of people here today on this call are probably very active Baha'is who know a lot about the history and such, but I'm sure there's new people, so we'll try to fill you in on these, you know, information. And put a question in the chat if I, you know, talk about something that you have no idea about. I'll be glad to explain it better. Okay. I also want to just start out by letting you know what my sources are. Even though I was raised in a Baha'i family, and my family did have a lot to do, my ancestors, with him, with Louis Gregory becoming a Baha'i, but they didn't really talk about it a lot. So I didn't really know much more than anybody else until this book came out. And as a matter of fact, I believe my parents and probably my Aunt Barbara and all of us, we didn't know that much about it. All the letters and the things that are in the archives now that we can study had not, we hadn't seen them. They were all in the archives. So when this book came out, it just floored me, you know, to find out all the things that they had to do with him. And I, of course, knew who he was growing up. Many people really kind of thought that he was the first African-American Baha'i, which is not true. But anyway, many of those facts all came out of this book. Gail Morrison did a wonderful job of putting it together. And she went to those archives where the letters are, that the Hannens and the Lewis and the Agnes Parsons and all kinds of people from the DC area, all the Baha'is, you know, wrote letters to each other, and they're all in the archives. And so that's where the source is, where you can find out all this information. More recently, Gail has written an article for the, what's it called? It's Baha'i Encyclopedia Project. And it's a shorter, you know, if you want to get the whole story, but in a shorter version, it's wonderful. It has a lot of information, and it's very more updated than the book is. So, and then also a lot of, here's the book. I'm just, if you can see me, look at all the stuff. I mean, it just very well used book. And then also my own book. A lot of, you know, some of the stories I'm going to be reading are from here, but they're all from the same sources.
We can't see the book. We can't see you.
Oh, nobody can see me? Okay, I didn't know that.
No, we can see you. No, we can see you, but on the side window, because you're sharing the screen. So
okay. Well, anyway, the book, right at the beginning, I think they had a picture of it. It has pictures. There's going to be a lot of pictures. You'll see pictures here. So, but those are my sources for this presentation. The article that Gail wrote really gave a lot more information about Louis's early upbringing. and his ancestors and such, more than what was in the original book, I think. So I want to tell you a little bit about that. Oops. Somehow or other, my pages got mixed up. Yikes. Sorry about that. Like, I know that's not what I'm supposed to be saying. Thank you for bearing with me. Okay. This article, the article tells you more about his history, and Lewis's grandmother was actually an enslaved woman on a plantation in South Carolina. Her enslaver was a powerful man, a farmer, state senator, and a judge even. And when he impregnated her, as often occurred in those circumstances, they had a daughter, best known as Elizabeth. Her name was Elizabeth. That man died in 1859 while slavery was still happening, and a few years before the Civil War emancipated the slaves. When he died, his mother and Elizabeth were both still stayed on the plantation. They weren't sold off like often happened. So they were there until the Civil War occurred and they were emancipated. So at that time, they were freed, and Mariah, she actually, her husband, Mariah was his grandmother, was the name of the woman who was impregnated by her enslaver. Her husband, she actually had a husband too. Her husband was a blacksmith, but when they got out of, out on their own, he was killed by the Ku Klux Klan because he was making too much progress in his life. And during
I'm sorry,
that,
I have to interrupt a moment. Now, who are you talking about right now?
Right now I'm talking about Mariah is Louis Gregory's grandmother.
Okay.
And his daughter, Elizabeth, was Louis Gregory's mother. Her daughter was Louis Gregory's mother. And we're going to get in a little bit farther into that. So it got very confusing to me too. I had to read the article over and over again because their names kind of mixed up, and I'm just trying to give the bare bones of it. So it won't take too much time. But so his grandparents were slaves. That father died by the Ku Klux Klan. And then Elizabeth then got some education at that time. And when she was a teenager, she married Ebenezer George, who was a blacksmith. And he was noted as being a literate person and a mulatto. He had been a slave though also before. So they had two sons, and the eldest, the younger one was Louis. So at that point, Louis was born in 1974. So that's about 10 years after the end of the war and slavery had ended. So I want to get it straight because it's confusing. So while Louis was still quite young, his father, this Ebenezer George, he died also. So he died from an illness. So at that point, the family was very poor. It was just Louis and his brother and living with his mother, Elizabeth. And Mariah, I think the grandmother was there too for a while. Then in 1881, Elizabeth married a man named George Gregory. And that's where Louis gets his name from. He's described as a freeborn native of Charleston from a property holding family. He was a black man. He was a Union veteran and a carpenter by trade. So that man is the one in the picture here. And he is Louis's stepfather. And it was these two people, and the picture of the woman here in the article, it didn't make it clear whether this was Mariah, who took on the name Mary Bacot after she was freed, or whether this is his mother, Mary Elizabeth. So I don't know which one it is, but anyway, they both lived with Louis and his brother for a while, and with this, then she eventually married this man, who then, you know, took them on like sons and took care of them, and he ended up with his name, Louis George Gregory. So then, not around the time that he might have finished high school, his brother got sick and died, and not long after that, his mother passed away also. So then it was this man, George Gregory, was the one who took care of him and his brother. By that time, they were, you know, pretty much out of high school age or grown, but I think he didn't die until quite a bit later, like in 59 or something like that. No, would have been sooner than that. But anyway, he lived for quite a while. Maybe it was 29. So are we all clear on that? It's sort of a complicated stage, but anyway, he, by that time, because these women in his family and this man really valued education, it had a huge influence on him. And I think it's really important to know about people's ancestors sometimes. Just you can get clues on their own character, but also the values that they had. And it was very important to him that Louis, you know, get a good education. So from there, Louis was the first generation born in the South that had a right to a free education. And according to Morrison, he attended public primary schools provided for Black children at first. And as he was a brilliant student, he was able to attend a special school run by a missionary for promising young Black students, Black children. And he was able to, later he was able to attend the Avery Normal Institute, which was the first secondary school in that area. It was actually, yeah, in Charleston for African-American children or young people. And he graduated from there in 1891. And then he enrolled at Fisk University in Tennessee, which was one of the HBCU, the historically Black universities, built in 1866, right after the end of the Civil War. So he went there until 1896, where he received his bachelor's degree. So already by this point, we can see that Louis was an exceptional scholar, because coming from that background where, you know, hundreds and hundreds, you know, thousands of the African-American people were freed from slavery, but had no education at all until that point. And now, you know, it was a push to try to help them get educated. And not all of them were able to really do that, but Louis was ready and able, so he moved ahead. It is W.E.B. Du Bois coined the term for those people, the talented 10th. There was, you know, so few of them, but they were the ones who got that early education and were really moving ahead with their lives. There was only 0.02% of Black Americans who had earned a college degree at that time. So it was pretty special. So after teaching a few years at Avery, he decided that he wanted to become a lawyer. And of course, there was no schools in the South that would teach African Americans to be lawyers. You can kind of imagine why that might be, but so anyway, he had to move farther north, and so he went to Washington, D.C. to Howard University, which is another HBCU. college or university. And from there, he received his law degree. So in 1899, or he enrolled there in 1899, and he received his degree in 1902. He worked as a lawyer then until 1906 in Washington, D.C., and then took a job with the U.S. Treasury Department, which he worked at for several more years. So it is at this point where the story of how he became a Baha'i kind of begins. And also the time when he becomes acquainted with my ancestors. So he worked in that Treasury Department. And right at the same time, my ancestors, Pauline and Joseph Hannen, were actually becoming a Baha'i right about that time. In 1902 is when they were actually taking classes with Mirza Abul Fadl and Ali Quli Khan. Ali Quli Khan was a translator, but Mirza Abul Fadl had been appointed and asked, by Abdu'l-Baha to come to America and help teach. But he didn't know a lot of English, but he knew a great deal about the Bible and about the Baha'i faith. So Ali Quli Khan was good at English, so he helped to translate. So she went to those classes, and there's a lot in the book about how they found out about all that and how they got involved, but we're not going to go into that right now. But anyway, I'm going to find my place here. So they were going to those classes. Pauline and Joseph were a young white couple with 2 children living in DC around the vicinity of Howard University where Louis was going at the same time that Louis was there. And they were about the same age. Actually, Pauline and Louis were born the same year. They even lived in similar row houses that you see in DC, the houses that are right next, part of each other, kind of in a row. But they had some similarities in their upbringing, because I'm going to go back one step here, because Pauline she had German immigrant parents. So she was born in America, but her parents and older sisters were born in Germany. And Joseph he had a long ancestry of American all the way back before the Revolution. So he had been American, but Pauline's father had died when she was about 14, which is similar to Louis's mother dying, and Joseph's father had left when he was a baby. So they basically were all heavily influenced by their mothers in their lives. Let's see. So let me see. Somehow I'm getting my pages mixed up. So anyway, Pauline had an interesting experience not too long after she became a Baha'i, and I think it's very significant. It's one of the most interesting stories, I think, in the book, about how she went from growing up in the South. She actually lived in South Carolina for quite a while as a child, and it explains it in the story. And I'm going to read from her words what happened. She says, long before hearing of the Baha'i cause, when I was a little girl in Wilmington, North Carolina, teaching and environment had made me regard colored people with something like terror. I had known of the frightful retribution visited by whites on Negroes for offenses of which I assumed they must be guilty. At about 14, I was brought back to Washington, my birthplace. Walking one day in the shopping district, I found myself watching not the shop windows, but the passers-by. Many had Ethiopian marks, but were almost white or even blue-eyed. Why, I softly explained, before long we shall not be able to tell colored people from white. How terrible. Years passed, and the problem, for at least, passed with the years, but not the fear. So this is the background that she came from, which was very similar to what a lot of white people thought at that time living in the South. So it wasn't unusual at all. But then she became a Baha'i and she started reading the writings of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, and particularly about the oneness of humanity and things like that. And this is a quote right here that she particularly was thinking about. I'll read the story and tell you what happened while she was thinking about this, and then we'll read the quote at the end. Following the crisis of an illness of my baby son, I went to the market for Thanksgiving supplies. Returning to the street, I met a heavily set colored woman, her arms full of bundles, making her way amid the snow and ice in spite of flopping shoelaces, which she could not stoop to adjust. Something in the picture brought to me the spirit of universal brotherhood. I knelt in the snow and tied the wayfarer's shoes. She was astonished, and those who saw it appeared to think I was crazy. I did not mind this, and from that moment was possessed with a conviction that I must create a work of brotherhood among the colored people. Some words of Baha'u'llah had sunk deep into my consciousness. These, no doubt, were the motivating power which changed the current of my whole life, prompting me to uproot the prejudice of childhood and render loving service to all humanity. So here is the quote that she was thinking about, and think about, for those of you who are Baha'is especially, or how these words, I think this is a favorite hidden word of many people, and how these words might have changed your life as you turn to the Baha'i teachings. O children of men, know ye not why we created you all from the same dust, that no one should exalt himself over the other. Since we have created you all from the same substance, it is incumbent on you to be even as one soul, to walk with the same feet, eat with the same mouth, and dwell in the same land, that from your inmost being, by your deeds and actions, the signs of oneness and the essence of detachment may be made manifest. So from that point on, she really did make an effort to go out and teach in the Black community. And she started, you know, we won't go into all of that. A lot of it is in the book, but she started with a woman who worked for her, a washerwoman named Carrie York. And then she went on, she was teaching her sister about the faith, and Alma Knobloch, and Alma was a seamstress, and Pocahontas Pope was one of her worker that worked with her. And so she would listen, Pauline would be telling her, and Pocahontas also was listening and ended up becoming a Baha'i, and they were started having meetings in their home and inviting their friends. And so there was quite a few Black Americans who were becoming Baha'is in the DC area at that time. And that's kind of the environment in which Lewis ended up finding out about the Baha'i faith and coming into that group. So right now I'd like to also read from my book about his story about how he found the Baha'i faith. And after that, I won't be doing so much reading, but these are, I think, very critical stories. Oops, I have to change that. So he says, my first information about the revelation of Baha'u'llah came in the later part of 1907, just 30 years ago from when he wrote this. Mention of it came from one who might have been regarded as traditionally faux. At the time, I was a federal employee in the Treasury Department. There were two fellow clerks, white and very elderly, occupying with me the same room with my door between theirs. One of them was a one-armed veteran of the Civil War and a native of New England, inheriting all the traditions of New England, I suppose. The other was an intense partisan of the South, untouched in spirit by the influence which overcame slavery, but yet a man of unusual culture. It is amusing to recall how any question about the Civil War, innocently enough asked by me, would bring them into verbal conflict. They were both, to me, warm personal friends, such as I hope never to forget in time or eternity. It was the Southerner, Mr. Thomas H. Gibbs, who knew a little about the Baha'i teachings and was most urgent and insistent that I attend a meeting, which I had no inclination to do. As a matter of fact, his friends and others said that he was an agnostic by that time. He really didn't even believe in any religion. So he says, because he had promised his friend, you know, he would do it as a favor to him to go to this meeting. So he says, I went one cold, blustery, extremely unpleasant night to the address he gave me, a room in the old Corona building opposite the Treasury Department and long since demolished and supplanted by Keith's Theater. The only occupant in the room when I entered was Mrs. Pauline Hannen. She gave me an unusually cordial welcome, identified me as a friend of Mr. Gibbs, and told me that I would hear something very wonderful, though difficult. It would afford me an opportunity similar to that which had been mine had I lived on earth as a contemporary of Jesus Christ. She urged me to get a full understanding of the message of today, that through it, a work would be possible that would bless humanity. She kindly gave me 3 pieces of Baha'i literature, The Hidden Words, a daily book, and a small tract written by Charles Mason Remy. Soon thereafter entered another lady, Mrs. Lua Getzinger, referred to as our teacher. A little later came 2 colored ladies, Miss Millie York and Miss Nellie Gray. So uncomfortable was the night that no one else came. Mrs. Getzinger gave the message historically recounting the appearance of the Bab and Baha'u'llah and of the great persecutions and the martyrdoms in Persia. Her recital was brief, but vivid. Mrs. Hannen invited me to another meeting. It was held at the home of the 2 colored friends previously mentioned, among poor people. Mrs. Hannen was the speaker, and her loving service was impressive. She then invited me to her home where I would meet either herself or her husband for further teaching. Mr. Hannen thus became my teacher, a service in which he was aided by his wife. Over a period of over 18 months, I went to their home on Sunday evenings, sacrificing time previously given to social life. During this period, Mr. and Mrs. Hannen went on their pilgrimage to the Holy Land. As they were my sole connection with the faith, my interest waned during that absence. A long time afterwards, I learned that they had kindly mentioned me to the master, who had, that's Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, who had instructed them to continue teaching me, assuring them that I would become a believer and an advocate of the teachings. Upon their return, they remade the connection. Through the very unusual kindness of these dear friends, my mental veils cleared away, and the light of assurance mercifully appeared within when they had taught me the greatest name and how to pray. I became a confirmed believer about June 1909, and thereafter cooperated with the Hannens in arranging meetings and trying to give everyone its message. One curious thing was that by far the majority of my friends thought I had become mentally unbalanced. One of my old teachers, a professor of international law and a very affectionate friend, almost wept over my departure from orthodoxy, and with others warned me that I was blasting all hopes of a career. The Washington Bee, a well-known colored newspaper, on one occasion gave me 2 columns of ridicule, which remained unanswered. Others, knowing my controversial habits of the past, said, "He must have religion, since he does not answer that." There were always some who were willing to investigate, and the opposition seemed to promote inquiry. So that's his explanation of what happened that night. And on that second meeting, Pauline writes this about her experience. She says, one night she was at Carrie York's house. A handsome, intelligent-looking colored gentleman, yes, I mean just that, holder of degrees from several universities, entered that home. Abashed by so much scholarship, I had spoken to him before, so that at that previous meeting, I was flushed and nervous, but thought Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha sustained me, and I taught the lesson without confusion. The visitor was so impressed with the words of Baha'u'llah, as revealed in the Iqan, that he could not let it go. This was Louis Gregory. For a year or 2, he would attend the various meetings, and at the close of the week would come to our home. He told us afterward, "I came wondering whether you and Mr. Hannen could talk intelligently on other subjects or only on religion. I discovered that you both are interested in many topics, but after a while, you would both automatically return to the Baha'i teachings." Does that sound familiar to anybody? I thought there must be something in it after all. We had been praying, this is back to her words, we had been praying that someone among the Negro race would arise to serve them more effectively. We believe Louis to be the answer to that. So, as Louis mentioned in his story, the Hannens had gone on a pilgrimage, and I write quite a bit about that in my book, because Pauline really wanted Abdu'l-Baha to know what she was doing with teaching in the Black community and some of the issues that they had to deal with, because at that time, even inviting any Black people to their home was a big thing. Neighbors would even throw rocks and rotten tomatoes at the house and things like that. It was really terrible, but she would clean them up and try not to let the guests see anything like that. So anyway, it was not an easy thing for them to do, but they were very, very much, wanted to pursue that. So anyway, she also wanted to know from Abdu'l-Baha whether Mr. Gregory was the person that could help them, and he assured them that he would become a Baha'i and that he would be a great believer. So when they returned to America, they did that, and he did become a believer in 1909. As he also wrote, a lot of his Black friends gave him a hard time. And I think this next slide, this shows a few of the well-known not Baha'is, but African-American people at that time that are, very much known by a lot of people, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And there's a lot written about their conflicts over how the African-American people were going to interact with white people, basically, once they were free and educated. And Louis was very much a part of that group. He knew those people, had lots of conversations with them, and that can all be read about in Gail Morrison's book, but also in other articles. So we won't spend a lot of time on that, but it's just interesting to put in perspective when he was living and who he was in contact with. So anyway, once he became a Baha'i, though, he made a commitment to trying to spread the teachings in the community in Washington, D.C. And one of the places was the Bethel Literary and Historical Society, which was based at Howard University. And since they lived near there, and Joseph and Pauline lived there also, they began going there quite often and making acquaintances and meeting people. And they actually were able to give talks about the Baha'i faith to this organization, which was kind of an educational organization. They held meetings and gave talks to educate themselves about various things. So that was a part of their work, but they were also meeting among the poor people in town too. They met with all kinds of people, and a lot of that is in both of these books. One of the people or two of the people actually, this couple that they met at Howard, Coralie Cook was a professor there, and George Cook was a dean. They had very high positions at the college and had a lot of influence over, especially the women. Coralie worked with a lot of the young women, and she's also known for writing a letter to Abdu'l-Baha explaining the racial issues in America to him. It's a very good letter. It can be found in this book, Lights of the Spirit. And if anybody can see me, that's the book. Probably a lot of you have seen it. It's by Gwendolyn Eder Lewis and Richard Thomas put this together. And it has a lot of the writings of the early African-American Baha'is through the years. And so some of her writings, the letters she wrote to Abdu'l-Baha and other things that she wrote are in that book. And she was very influential later on when Abdu'l-Baha came to America in 1912. She was the one who arranged to have him speak at Howard University. And he gave a very memorable talk there on race unity. And that is celebrated in Washington, D.C. every year. They go to the university and have a special, program about it. So let's see. I wanted to just bring us back a little bit to Abdu'l-Baha, but it was in 1912 when he came to America. And well, before that even, Lewis was able to go and meet him. Pauline and Joseph had told him about their pilgrimage, and he wanted to go, and Abdu'l-Baha gave him permission. So he was going to go in 1911, and then Abdu'l-Baha asked him to wait just a little bit longer. And so then when he went is when he actually met his wife to be, Louisa Matthew, who he married, and I'm going to get to that. But I added this kind of toward the end, and I wanted to read this quote, but I have to move my pictures out of the way. My people were in the way of the quote. Oopsie, that was supposed to happen. I can't even see the first words. Maybe somebody else could. Amelia, maybe you could read this quote for me. Can you do that?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Today, the one overriding need is unity and harmony among the beloved of the Lord, for they should have among them but one heart and soul, and should, so far as in them lieth, unitedly withstand the hostility of all the peoples of the world. They must bring to an end the benighted prejudices of all nations and religions, and must make known to every member of the human race that all are the leaves of one branch, the fruits of one bough. Abdu'l-Baha.
Thank you. So when Abdu'l-Baha met, or when Louis met Abdu'l-Baha and heard these kinds of words from him, I'm just thinking how much that must have cemented in his heart of the importance and the truth of this message. And even though he had a lot of, problems with people, his other friends and people not agreeing with him about any of this, he was able, because he met Abdu'l-Baha and had that reassurance, to keep going and keep teaching. So I just wanted to bring that in. And also that he met Louisa while he was on this pilgrimage in 1911. And then later on, Abdu'l-Baha seemed to see in them a seed of more than just a friendship. And even though they would never, ever have thought about actually marrying each other in that time, in that culture, it would have been unheard of for a white man and a black man and a white woman to marry each other. So they would never have really thought of it on their own, but Abdu'l-Baha kind of said some things that made them feel like that it was going to be okay, that they should do this, it was fine. He didn't really push it on them, but he certainly allowed for the atmosphere to be able, that it was okay for them to do that. And they ended up getting married while Abdu'l-Baha was in America in 1912. So it was the first interracial Baha'i marriage. And it really, she writes about it in her book later that, this really did lead the way for the Baha'is to be able to do that. And since then, there have been many, many mixed marriages in the Baha'i faith. And it really has become one way of bringing the races together. It's certainly not the only thing that needs to be done, obviously, but it certainly is a good example. So from that point on, Louis traveled a great deal to many places in the South to teach the faith. He often spoke at a lot of the HBCUs like Tuskegee and others. He kept constant correspondence with the Hannens about the difficulties and the successes of his trips, and a lot of those were then reported to Star of the West magazine, and people learned about them. He once traveled all the way across the country. One of his trips, he traveled with a white Baha'i through the South, which was, very, really dangerous, brave of them to do. But that was very successful. They felt that God was with them and protected them through the whole trip. And so teaching was really one of the big things in his life that he did. But also he had such wonderful qualities and skills that he was recognized right away. Very early on, he was elected to the Washington, D.C. What do they call it? And in 1911, he was elected to the Working Committee in D.C., which is a precursor to local assemblies. And in a letter to Joseph, he expressed his great embarrassment to be chosen so quickly to such a post when there were so many other more experienced Baha'is to choose from. But his qualities could not be constrained, and he was soon elected to represent the Baha'is of DC and the executive board of the Baha'i Temple Committee, which was before we had a National Assembly. He was on that Temple Committee and re-elected several times. He was elected to the National Spiritual Assembly in 1922 and 24, and then again from 27 to 32 and 39 to 46. So he was doing those services, teaching and administrating for the rest of his life almost. At one time, he and his wife went to Haiti and stayed for a few years. And it was a place they could be together, because when he went to the South, she couldn't really go with him. So she actually went to Europe, and she opened the faith to, I think it was Bulgaria, and I have to find in my notes. Yugoslavia, I guess. And anyway, so she was doing a lot of her own services as well. I'm trying to get through this because I see that we're really running out of time here. So, but he did just so many wonderful services to the faith. And I think I want to, as I'm getting to a close here, I want to mention something that Gail wrote in her piece about the struggles that they had. It said, under the difficult conditions that characterized a prejudice and racially segregated society, the American Baha'i community struggled to exemplify its stated belief in the oneness of humanity. It experienced spurts of systematic progress, aroused by stirring calls to action by Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi, followed by periods of retrenchment and apathy. Throughout, Gregory led the way, demonstrated forbearance, dignity, and unshakable faith and vision. You know, and those of us who know, you know, the Baha'i faith well, we know that, you know, this is a struggle in America, especially. And it's something that we're continue to work on. And Abdu'l-Baha always promoted it and encouraged the Baha'is. The whole time he was in America, he always called for, he wanted to be in mixed meetings. He didn't even want to go if there wasn't going to be a mixed group. And, you know, and then Shoghi Effendi, of course, wrote very much about that issue. And the Universal House of Justice is still encouraging us to continue working on that issue. The last thing here too, he was on the National Race Amity Committee for many years. Abdu'l-Baha, before he died, he had asked for the Baha'is to organize a conference. And this just gives you an idea of the people that came to, this is the second one, I think, but they had one in Washington, D.C., and then this one, I believe, is in Massachusetts, maybe. But there were for several years, they were holding these huge conferences called Race Amity conferences. He was always very involved with those. And also many of the people that Pauline and Joseph taught the Baha'i faith to, like Elaine Locke and the Cooks and others, they were also members of those committees helping to organize these. Unfortunately, Joseph died before the first one. He was in a car accident and died fairly young. But Louis and Pauline carried on with this. So anyway, I think it's time to, I have one, just this last one is, this is their grave sites that are right near Greenacre Baha'i School. There's a cemetery there, and that's where they are buried. And I finally was able to go this past year and see them. I was very happy to be able to do that. So anyway, that's what I have. And I'm sorry if I went over time. I hope we have time for questions.
Actually, you're very good. You didn't go over time. We still have until 8:30. So if there is anything, Judy, that you wanted to add, since you are definitely not over time. So if there is something else that you wanted to add.
No, that's pretty much what I had. I mean, there's so much in the book and also in my book that he did so much. It's really, it would take a whole class, you know, a long session to just really see all the wonderful contributions that he made. And the fact that he did this, you know, it was such a sacrifice because he pretty much had to give up his career possibilities. He was one of the few people, along with my Pauline sisters, Alma and Fanny Knobloch, and some others who were subsidized by the National Teaching Committee back in those days. They were given some money to at least travel, and then often people would host them when they got to wherever the towns that they were going to be speaking in, and they would help them with whatever they needed, but they didn't have any extra money for, you know, anything. they really sacrifice a great deal for the faith, and people have to recognize that. And eventually he was honored to be a hand of the cause. It was after his death, but it was just felt that, you know, his sacrifices were so great for the faith that he deserved to have that honor of being a hand of the cause. So he was the first African-American hand of the cause, the first African-American National Assembly member, and so many other first, but not the first Baha'i, African-American Baha'i in America. There were others who did.
Judy, would you mind stop sharing?
Yeah,
Because
let me find
we want
that.
to see
Okay,
you.
there we go. Yeah,
That's
okay.
better.
Thank you.
That's awesome. This was so fascinating, and I think it gives us an opportunity to go back and reread the story of Louis Gregory and the people surrounding him. So it's not just the one person, the sacrifices of, you know, the husband and wife together and living in that environment that even now it's difficult. I can't even imagine how difficult it must have been at that time, but it gives us an inspiration that, you know, sometimes we feel like, what can one person do? All we have to do is look into the books and find out what one person, one candle can illumine a country. And we have
Yes.
so many examples of that. So this was phenomenal, Judy. Thank you so much. On behalf of everyone that is here, I know that it takes so much time to put things together, and it would take hours, but to condense it, I think it's the hardest thing.